la dico in termini un po' burocratici, ma insomma sull'ordine dei lavori. L'ordine dei lavori, noi abbiamo 2 ore di tempo e la cosa migliore.
We have a couple of hours for our meeting this afternoon, and I think the best way to handle this would be to hear from Fiamma and her colleagues who have participated in the publication and the writing of the book, and after their remarks, the Italian guests, as it were, will have a chance to illustrate their ideas and comments on the opening remarks made by our friends here. So I wish to thank Fiamma for having chosen this venue for this discussion, and I thank all the attendees and Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Della Vedova, Mr. Manciulli, who is on his way, and Mr. D'Ambruoso, who is on his way up as well. I thank them all for participating and for contributing to our debate this afternoon. So I'll give the floor right over to Fiamma.
Chito, si sente. Grazie.
Thank you very much to the chairman of the committee, Mr. Chiquito. Is that too loud? Yes, don't get too close to the microphone, please. So thank you for having agreed to host our presentation. This is a world premiere. The world, in fact, the book was released just a couple of days ago. Nobody's had a chance to see it, and nor have we ever been able to hold it until just yesterday, just last night. And in fact, I received it just last night. So there are many of us here, and I will try to be brief. I wish to apologize for Professor Dorigold, who is not going to be here. Unfortunately, he had a serious health problem, and hopefully he's going to be better, and unfortunately he was not able to join us. In any case, there are quite a few of us here, and I'm sure we'll be able to have an in-depth debate. And the people who are here play an essential role in the creation of this material. In fact, the book contains 9 essays. It is an idea that came up at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. It is a think tank. And I'm thinking that many of you have already heard about this center. We cover many issues, important issues, world policies, Middle East, terrorism, the war, and I'm proud to be a member of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and I am a member of the Council for European Affairs at the center. So this is an idea based on the concept of sharing and the fact that we are very fond and feel close to Europe. Not necessarily an example or a model, but we're trying to share with this project, with this work, what unfortunately has been the experience acquired by Israel. It began before its foundation even. In other words, when the very idea of Israel started becoming important, so in the 1920s. Since then, and you'll see in the essays, in particular the historical essay by Ambassador Freddie Eitan, here he studies the history of the West's struggle against terror and the relationship between Israel and the fight against terrorism, in fact. And as I said, this all started way back in the 1920s. There have been losses and victories as well. we're going to be illustrating the text today, and this is in fact the reason why, over the years, we've seen a lot of suffering due to terrorism, on the one hand in Israel, and on the other, Europe at large. If you have a look at the cover of the book, you'll see two identical attacks, and both of them were perpetrated by a truck which ran people over, people in a crowd. In Berlin, there were 84, in Nice, there were 84 victims. This is the Berlin attack in the picture, but there was an identical attack in Nice, in fact, with 84 victims, and in Jerusalem, in Tayela, which is an area not only where there are many tourists milling around, but there were buses of soldiers. They were there on a trip, and there was a truck that was driven by a terrorist. The truck not only ran over everyone, but we saw the truck going back and forth, running over the bodies of these young men, crushing the bodies of these young men. So what is the purpose, the rationale of our work and our proposal? Well, we think that the reasons and therefore the understanding of this phenomenon are identical. This is something that has always been questioned and debated. Often we see the lists of names. This is very painful. Even the Pope recently had a list of cities where there were terrorist attacks, and no mention was made of Jerusalem. Instead, this is one of the cities in the world where there are more terrorist attacks than elsewhere. So Dori Gold wrote the first essay in the book. Is it the same kind of terrorism? Can we say that the terrorism against Israel is the same kind of terrorism attacking the rest of the world? Or are the people right when they say something that is explained in a very straightforward manner here, i.e., terrorism against Israel can be tackled through a political debate, because it's a political and territorial issue. There could be solutions found if only people could give the terrorists what they're expecting to achieve. Dori Gold proves that that's not the case. The other form of terrorism, well, there's nothing that can really stop it, because it is a form of terrorism that simply aims at destroying cultures and religions that are not part of Islam, and therefore we can't really do anything about it in a pragmatic and constructive way. So in his essay, Dori Gold takes this idea apart. Now, the essay is very important, of course. The theme is the identity of terrorism, which strikes out against Israel, and then the terrorism which attacks the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. This is dealt with in the numerous essays, and even Dan Diker writes an important essay because he shows that many times we get it completely wrong when we try to interpret terrorism, and this results in catastrophic mistakes on the ground and in the way we conceive and devise the solutions. And Dori Gold says something quite simple, and that is that in actual fact, on the part of the Palestinians, there is no desire to find a pragmatic and practical solution to this issue, whereby the Jews, women, children, civilians are hit in a devastating way time and time again. And we see that when there is a large portion of a country, Gaza, for example, that is freed or liberated, well, that becomes and has become one of the main bases of an active form of terrorism, Hamas, not only because they send out into Israel suicide terrorists, large numbers of suicide terrorists, which is what we've seen over the years, but in addition to that, the liberated areas are used as missile bases, very active bases, in order to hit and strike out against the civilian population. So these are examples that are repeated over and over again, and in many of the essays you'll find an explanation, a very painful explanation, for the fact that terrorism always stems from an ideological matrix. And we know in Europe to what extent an ideology can kill the masses, and it becomes a cancer in our contemporary world. And in fact, terrorism always has ideological roots and profound causes. And how can we negotiate with terrorists or terrorism, and how we must deal with it? Therefore, in a more simple and straightforward way, and that is by fully understanding the root causes. It is only by having a clear understanding of what it all means that we can hope to comprehend and understand why it is. And this is what we see in all of the essays in the book. We know that there is an ongoing change, and Mr. Cooper-Wasser, in fact, will explain this to you. And this is what characterizes the war waged by Israel against terrorism. And this is the only way that we can take it down, not by hiding behind our deceptions, our illusions, as it were. But we have to have an exact understanding of what it is in order to fight it. So this is the idea that we have pursued in these complex essays. And now, of course, it's difficult for me to describe them all thoroughly. In any case, there's the feeling that terrorism in the Western world is seen as an incomprehensible phenomenon. In other words, it is difficult for our societies, our civilization, to imagine why someone would want to wake up in the morning and blow himself up and at the same time kill women and children. I'm also an Israeli national in addition to being Italian, and we're sort of bewitched by this. We're hypnotized, I would say. So, in Europe, we're seeking responses and solutions that perhaps are far removed from any evidence. In our work, in our book, there's an essay written by the psychoanalyst, Mr. Mansdorf, and he says, one of the secrets with which we've managed to take down terrorism, or to fight terrorism, can be explained with 3 words. Keep it simple. Keep it simple. They hate us, they want to hurt us, and we've got to defend ourselves. So let's stop imagining and thinking about the motivations and whether they are resulting from social causes, or maybe that person was a bit disturbed mentally, and the fact that on websites there were instructions given or models that that terrorist was fascinated by. But the truth of the fact is that this is a macroscopic phenomenon. It is gigantic, and it presents itself as a war, and the war has to be identified and understood for what it actually is. It is a war of the development of our understanding, the evolution of our understanding. And this is what we talk about. And in particular, I'm referring to the essays by Mr. Cooper-Wasser and by Mr. Dan Dijker, who are here. Mr. Cooper-Wasser is a general, and he was the director of the Ministry for Strategic Affairs, and he's dealt with this in a very active way, and he can help us understand from within how terrorism changed over time, because at first someone would go and place a bomb in some refrigerator in a city center, and then maybe they would hijack an airplane, and then kidnap people, and then blow people up with their bombs, and then they would kidnap and abduct soldiers for years and years, and then they began using knives and then trucks and so on and so forth. So each time Israel had to change and adapt its strategies, and this modification of strategies, I don't know if this can be seen as a model for Europe, but in any case we will provide you with this idea. This is its real design, as it were. It is quite concrete. And on the other hand, in Europe, there's been a desire to think of a different reality. And this is what Dan is going to talk to us about. And there are other essays that deal with this matter as well. And the phenomenon of terrorism became a category of a disturbed soul, or a category of the distressed person, someone who is suffering due to social and cultural reasons. And they became that way incomprehensible ideas. And an important example of this is that they abolished the word extreme Islam, extremist Islam. In fact, this has been abandoned, and yet it was so evident over time in the relationship between Israel and the rest of the world. And now, let me say something about my essay. I'm sure that in addition to all this strategic terrain, as it were, the strategic matter which has been dealt with in the essays, there are still two important points. One is dealt with by Professor Asa Kasher. I don't know whether you know him. He's a very important person in the history of Israel, because he wrote the ethical conduct handbook or manual for Israeli soldiers. The Israeli army is the only one that has a handbook containing ethical principles that are not religious in any way. They're inspired by the Jewish principles in the broad sense of the term, principles of democracy and universal justice. And Professor Kasher keeps going back to the subject of the universality of the Israeli experience and the way in which this country has tried, throughout the ideological and physical persecution that has been taking place throughout all these years, try to hold on to a compass which is made of restraint. How do you say restraint in Italian?
Contenimento di
Some sort of self-discipline and resilience. So we have two R's, restraint and resilience, which means the ability to resist from within very profoundly. And this is in fact what I write about in my essay. I explain how people can resist. I mean, it's incredible that they even manage to do that. They show moral strength without becoming fierce, ferocious, fascist, aggressive, and without becoming racist. Considering the fact that on a daily basis they are attacked. And why? Why? How can they resist? How can they be so resilient? So it is a complex description contained in the essay, and there are all sorts of statistics as well. And I try to explain how people can get used to this idea throughout their lives. And even the army is trained physically and psychologically to put up with this, with these difficulties. People learn how to be patient and how not to be afraid. And in particular, an Israeli has two characteristics or features that are very similar or close to one another. The first being that an Israeli always knows that when he or she turns around when there's a terrorist attack, there's always going to be somebody there to help him out. This is very typical in Israeli society. And it's also true. I mean, if you have a flat tire on your car, or if you feel sick and you have to sit down on a bench, there is solidarity. And this solidarity has grown together with the risk, the ever-growing risk. So in this country, there are risks. Well, the country knows how to react to that risk. Youngsters know that they are living in difficult times and that they might die, they might be killed. Well, they're like Shlomi. This is the character that I talk about in my essay, a waiter who caught a terrorist with a bomb on his back. He took off his backpack. He took his backpack off of his shoulders and he threw it far away. And I asked him, weren't you afraid to blow up and into pieces? And he said, yes, of course I was afraid. But then he said to me, quite calmly, wouldn't it have been better for me to die on my own rather than the other 50 people who were sitting here? So that is the logic, and it is clearly not a simple logic. It is a logic, a rationale, which requires a cultural effort, some sort of identification with an ideal, a huge, gigantic ideal. But I have the feeling that somehow Europe and the United States are going to have to learn. They'll have to learn something from all this if they want to tackle this challenge. So I'm going to stop now. I would like to say many more things, but let me just end on a personal note, if you don't mind. I'm very touched and moved to be able to be here. I was a deputy chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of this Parliament, and oftentimes I sat at this very table in similar debates seen from the other side. Now I'm here together with my colleagues from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs to talk to the Italian Parliament about this matter. And I guess that I've come full circle now, and this is very important for me. Hopefully, I'll be able to contribute and to show my sentiment, my feeling, which is that I identify with values, the values of restraint and resilience. And this is how not only Israel, but all of Europe and all of the world will be able to defeat terrorism.
Allora.
I'll now give the floor over to Mr. Yossi Cooper-Wasser.
Mr. Chiquito, and thank you, Fiamma, for not only the presentation, but also the words you said in the end. I know you are a very committed Italian, and you are a very committed Israeli at the same time, so it's really great to hear that from you. What I'm going to present here is my notes about the national security aspect of fighting terror. And I'm going to speak about it after I was fighting terrorism for 40 years, more or less, as a soldier, and later on as an official of the government, as the Director General of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. And when you fight terror, when you're a soldier, you see it as a very tactical issue. The more you grow up and you become a colonel and a general, you begin to have a wider view of the matter, and you understand that, yes, there are many encounters between terror and the targets of terrorism, but eventually it all adds up to some strategic sum up. and strategic view. And as you reach these levels, you have to be able to see the strategic aspect. And the fact is that in those many years, and for many more years before that I was in the military, Israel's experience of fighting terror has led it to an understanding that terror is a strategy that presents a significant threat to Israel's national security. Even if most of the time it appears as a low-intensity action with limited damage and impact, like every attack cannot be of strategic importance. This understanding was adopted, this understanding that this is a strategy, was adopted gradually after a long period of time through which Israel acted against the threat as if it were a strategic threat, but tried to convince itself that was not. We used to call it current security problems, not a strategic threat, until we realized and we actually called it by its name. From a national security point of view, the battle against terror is first and foremost a battle of learning. The results of this battle depend on the quality of learning on both sides. The faster we understand the way of thinking of the other side and the operational and tactical derivatives of the changes he may adopt as a result of the changes in the framework in which the battle takes place, and his understanding of the changes in our strategy, the better. That learning provides a greater chance that we shall be able to change our behavior in a way that will minimize the enemy's expectations to make progress on the strategic level and ultimately convince him to give up terror as a way of achieving its strategic goals. It may even lead the enemy to reassess the validity of those strategic goals themselves. And these are the objectives of our activity. These are our strategic goals in the fight against terror. Obviously, conflicts in which one of the sides chooses to employ terror as a way of action are long and protracted. And changes in strategy and strategic goals are last choices for those who perpetrate terrorism. Nevertheless, it is possible to convince the enemy to change its policy and maybe even its strategic goals. Israel managed several times to bring the Palestinians to the conclusion that they should change their policy regarding terror. But until now, it has not been able to, in its attempt to convince them to give it up as a preferred way of action and to change their strategic goals. So even though we had many successes in our fight, we haven't reached yet the ultimate success. They have not changed their goals and not their attitude towards terrorism as a preferred way of action. Studying the Palestinian terror against Zionism, the Jewish national movement, this studying allows us to clarify its goals and the nature and strategy to achieve them. The goal of this terror was and remained the demise of Zionism. As a matter of fact, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas himself, wrote a book that is called Zionism from Inception to Demise. And he published it in 1977 and it republished it in 2012, only 5 years ago. And the idea behind it is that by sowing fear in the hearts of the Zionists, then we shall be able to bring the end of Zionism. The objectives were to show how insecure the Jews were in the disputed land in order to convince them that their endeavor is doomed and to plant doubts in their minds and in the minds of their allies in the West regarding their rights and the justification of their narratives. Both national and religious argumentation were used to justify the attempt to attack the Zionists, civilian and security, and to program the minds of the Palestinians to support terror and execute it when they are asked or expected to do so. We follow even today the incitement, we follow the textbooks, we follow the way the Palestinian Authority pays salaries to terrorists that are serving time in Israeli jails and pays allocations to the families of the martyrs, as they call them, terrorists that lost their lives in the context of carrying out operations against Israel. This is all in order to tell the Palestinian people terrorism is one of the justified ways of struggling against Zionism. And this is still going on. Based on this understanding, it becomes clear that the strategic answer to the threat of terror was and still is the ability to convince the terrorists that their way of action is futile. The Israelis have to demonstrate to their adversaries that they are determined, with their solidarity as Fiamma described it, that they are determined to continue building and protecting their project, the democratic nation state of the Jewish people, that they deeply believe that Zionism is justified and just, that the values they stand for are noble and worth defending and fighting for, and that they enjoy international support for their cause. At the same time, the Israelis have to show that they can find ways to minimize the damage inflicted on them through terror, and in the context, in this context, weaken the capabilities of the terrorists. And we have to fight. It's not just showing that we are committed to our values. We have to fight in order to make sure that the ability to hurt us is minimized. The Palestinians do not just use terror as a major means of action in this battle, but its use is by itself a deliberate manifestation of the cultural difference they wish to emphasize. By using terror, its proponents and perpetrators try to convey the message that they won't be deterred from this policy until they achieve their goal, because in their culture, in contrast to Western and Israeli culture, life is not a sacred value. Honor and sacrifice are, and therefore the international law based on Western values that put life as the most important value does not apply to them. The effective learning by Israel and the determined spirit of the Israelis made it possible for Israel to overcome the repetitive terror waves and often deny the Palestinians a strategic victory. On occasions, though, the Palestinians managed to achieve some interim goals when they faced weak Israeli leadership, a naive and misinformed international community, and the mismatch between the Palestinian goal of eliminating Zionism and the Zionist impulsive wish of making peace prematurely with the Arab, including the Palestinians. We hope that this is going to change soon. As a result, many Palestinians still consider terror as a vital and successful tool to make progress towards their long and medium-term goals. The imbalance between the terror groups and Israel, or any other Western state for that matter, is reflected, among other things, in the different ways they view operational and strategic success or failure. The terrorists may view success as the mere existence of a terror act that has an impact, regardless of the success of the attacks in inflicting casualties on their enemy. Of course, they realize that more damage means greater impact, and that if they manage to outsmart their enemy, like 9/11, they will gain extra strategic points. Israel and or any other Western state, on the other hand, has to set as its operational target the prevention of all terror attacks. We cannot afford any terror attack. This may distort the meaning of victory in the ongoing terror and counter-terror wars Israel has fought. The mere success of the terrorists to harm Israel and survive the Israeli reaction is presented by the terrorists as a divine victory, while Israel treats the perpetration of any attacks as a tactical or operational failure. Israel judges the results on the strategic level. Did Israel force its will over the terrorist, or vice versa? And did Israel achieve its goals in the specific confrontation? Success is gauged on whether Israel has re-established deterrence, reassured its citizens about their long-term security, gained a long lull between terror attacks, and sometimes whether the terrorists were forced to change their strategy altogether. In most cases, Israel was able to achieve the goals it set for itself and could consider itself victorious, even if it suffered numerous terror attacks. The learning competition is very relevant to the ever-growing operational tactics that Palestinians and Lebanese terror organizations use against Israel. Whenever a certain tactic is adopted by a terror group as its leading way of action, Israel seeks a way to defend itself against this specific challenge and force its enemies to give it up. Learning was also the way Israel developed its practice of fighting terror in a wide variety of aspects that together comprise the comprehensive strategy of fighting terror. It's made of preventing, thwarting terror attempts, deterrence, reaction, and resilience. These are the four elements that comprise our strategy. Let's look at those four and see what we did on them. Prevention basically is based on the following elements. First, intelligence. To prevent, you got to have intelligence. Israel studied meticulously the behavior and logic that cultivates the terrorist thinking and their subsequent modus operandi. As a result, Israel developed various state-of-the-art capabilities in all aspects of intelligence to follow the terrorists' activities so that many terror attempts were prevented and foiled in advance. Israel also understood relatively early on that since terror disregards national boundaries, there is a necessity of developing cooperation between the different Israeli intelligence services. Those who deal with local intelligence, those who collect intelligence internationally, and the police intelligence, to enable fusion of all relative information necessary to prevent terror attacks. It also realized that this cooperation needs to go beyond the Israeli national intelligence services and extend to foreign ones, including Italy, of course, but also including those in countries that Israel does not have diplomatic relations with. Intelligence collection is done according to the law, of course, but with priority given to the needs of preventing attacks that may threaten lives over privacy, which, when such contradiction of values appears. Protection is the second element in prevention. Israel has developed a very robust set of protection protocols, in most cases as a result of the learning process following protection failures. For example, after attempts to hijack Israeli airplanes, Israel embarked on a high-profile protection plan for its airports and civilian aircraft that proves itself as capable of deterring and foiling terror attacks. The same is true for protecting shopping centers, the coastline, Israeli and Jewish facilities around the world, and other strategic targets. Out of necessity, Israel wasn't shy of using some sort of profiling in this context. Military operations are the third element. The military operations play a major role in protection in the form of checkpoints, barriers, and secure defense, which enable the IDF to deny entry of terrorists. On top of them, when faced with a danger that cannot be thwarted otherwise, Israel takes military activity to foil the terror attempts based on the intelligence it gathers. This may take the form of arrests when possible and targeted preventive attacks when arrests are not possible. For the performance of such military operations, Israel has developed various capabilities such as light, precise munition and units of disguised soldiers who look like Palestinians when arrests are called for without giving the terrorist an early warning. One major lesson learned in that is that military presence or access to the areas where the terrorists prepare their attacks is necessary. And without it, prevention becomes much more difficult. Number 4 is affecting force buildup attempts. Terrorists' efforts to improve their capabilities cannot always be totally foiled. But Israel has adopted a policy of trying to slow down as much as possible these efforts by proactive intervention to deny the terrorists weapons and other capabilities. This explains our siege over the shores of Gaza. The fifth is public awareness. If all of that fails, we have to rely on public awareness. And every Israeli is always on high alert to notice potential terror threats and knows what must be done once the existence of such a threat is recognized. For example, an unattended luggage will immediately catch someone's attention in Israel. Reaction is the second part. It is based on the following elements. First, again, military operations. What can we do? Israel is always on high alert to deal militarily or through its police force with any terror attack. Israeli security forces intervene almost immediately and are able in many cases to save lives. Israel has developed special units, capabilities and techniques to ensure efficient intervention. But Israel also uses its intelligence and military capabilities to react in a precise manner against perpetrators and those who send them to or assist them from within its enemies. Israel has made it crystal clear that no terrorist is immune from punishment. At the same time, Israel goes to great lengths, way beyond any other country, in trying to ensure that these military actions cause minimal unintended damage to uninvolved people. And we showed that, I think, in this last confrontation we held in Gaza. Second in reaction is the active and passive defensive reaction. Israel has developed a variety of tools that enable it to react defensively once it is attacked by a terrorist organization. The most famous element in this is the Iron Dome, the anti-missile rocket system, that enables us to intercept incoming rockets and missiles, actually 90% of the incoming rockets and missiles that are intended to hit civilian targets. It's amazing. Number three in this respect is the legal activity. The Israeli law and legal systems are adjusted to the need to fight terror and punish those who incite terror or perpetrate it. It also provides the legal basis for the military operations against terror. Amongst other things, the law enables the government to outlaw organizations that are involved in terrorism. Israeli security agencies may temporarily hold suspects under administrative detention if showing evidence regarding their involvement in terror in court will damage intelligence capabilities. Israel, of course, adheres to relevant international law of armed conflict and the humanitarian law. And there's a full chapter in the book about, actually 2 chapters in the book, about how we respect the law in our fight against terrorism. Third element is resilience. I think Fiamma touched upon it a little bit, but let me say a few words about that. The ability to withstand a terror attack or a terror campaign and recover rapidly is a well-known feature of the Israeli society. With a long history of terror attacks, Israelis have sadly come to realize that terror is a part of their lives and that sometimes the prevention and the reaction to it fail to provide full security. We realize that. We don't like it, but we realize it. But when such a situation occurs, the government and the population are well rehearsed and capable of maintaining order and reasonable daily routine. The education system, police, first responders, and home front command inside the Ministry of Defense, when necessary, have developed special expertise in preparing the public, raising its resilience level, and operating systems that provide the public needs. This considerably erodes the strategic impact of terrorism, even if they are successful. And last, deterrence. Shaping the thinking of the enemy about the expected response to the next terror attempt in a way that would convince the terrorists to refrain from carrying out is always a critical goal of Israeli activity in fighting terror. Of course, all of what was mentioned above regarding prevention, reaction, and resilience are elements that contribute to the buildup of deterrence. But on top of these, the punishment system has a significant role in deterring the next terrorists. Recently, Israel resumed in this context the practice of demolishing the houses of terrorists. Policy also plays a major role in building deterrence. The commitment not to allow terrorism to have any strategic gain is key in this respect, and with very few exceptions. One of the very well-known exceptions is when we made all kinds of deals to release prisoners for the release of our prisoners that were taken by Hamas or by Hezbollah. Another important element in the overall strategy is dealing with radicalization, both its prevention and the de-radicalization of those already indoctrinated. Israel tries to mobilize the international community to put pressure on the Palestinians to stop their hate indoctrination and the programming of the Palestinian minds from very young ages to support and carry out terrorism. It is also trying to convince international social media corporates such as Facebook and Google, to restrict the use of the internet for incitement to terror and to cooperate with other Western countries in this context. So far, the results of all these efforts are quite marginal, unfortunately. We have to do more. And recently, Israel managed to stop radicalization of some Palestinian youngsters by approaching them after monitoring the beginning of the change in their behavior on social media and informing their family about it. I want to say here a word about the use of the cyber domain for the purpose of terrorism. It's not only for radicalization, which is one of the areas that is most visible. It's also for running operations. We all saw how most of the ISIS operations were run through Telegram and other options that enable terrorist groups to communicate from afar in a very secured way. And this is another challenge we are facing. I was speaking earlier about intelligence very briefly, but this is a very challenging area in which Israel has developed, because its knowledge of Islamic culture and what are the terms used in this context, we have developed a very good capability to indicate the early stages of a build-up of a radicalization process with a certain individual, so that we shall be able to take action on time and reach this person and try to see if there is something we can do in order to de-radicalize him on time, or if it's necessary, if we know him and we know the tag number of his car and we know we have his picture and so on, we can give some early warning if there's no time to de-radicalize him and we just have to take a protective measure. We can still do that, and all of that is a part of this entire battle that's happening on cyber. And besides the issue of cybersecurity itself, of protecting ourselves against terror cyber attacks, that's another element of what we're doing on the cyber. There's a chapter I wrote in this paper about cyber and the terrorism and our experience in that. Is a separate chapter. Anyhow, to sum it up, Israel's force build-up for fighting terror is part and parcel of its overall strategy. On top of building specialized units which have developed special practices fit for their specific missions, a considerable component in its capabilities to cope with terror threats is based upon its ability to develop state-of-the-art technological solutions to its various operational needs, both the Iron Dome and now the David Sling that is supposed to give us an active defense against missiles coming from Hezbollah, and all those issues of cybersecurity that I was mentioning just a minute ago. All of these are elements of our technological capabilities that were developed out of need. And I would maybe add one other thing that we did in this respect. We have a system that guarantees that the best people that are going to be recruited to the military will go for this purpose at the age of 18. They go to be involved in the technological effort to find solutions to these problems. And once it's very, in a short-sighted way of looking at it, it sounds like a stupid decision. Why won't you let these people do something more productive for the economy? In the long term, not only that it's good for fighting terror, it's also excellent for the economy. Because what they learn when they are 18 until 25 or something, they can then use in the industry, and the high-tech industry that we have. And just fortunately we were able a few days ago to sell for $15 billion one of our high-tech companies to Intel. So it's also from an economic point of view, it's a good idea. To sum up, Israel's overall strategy of fighting terror is a comprehensive approach that was developed out of ongoing learning efforts. Understanding the goals and strategy of the enemy and the context in which it operates, and being agile enough to rapidly adopt adequate responses that build on former solutions, enabled Israel to become a world leader in the fight against terror. Thank you.
Grazie. Saluto l'onorevole Bernardo.
My greetings to Mr. Bernardo, who is the president of the Italy-Israeli Friendship Group. And now I'll give the floor over to our next speaker, Mr. Dan Diker.
Join us? Great. Thank you very much, Chairman Cicitto. Thank you very much to Fiamma, my friend for many years and a colleague, and someone who introduced me to this great country. I have been in Italy now more than any other Israeli where I live, probably about 20 to 25 times in the last 10 years, and I'm, maybe besides Cooper, I think Yossi's here more than I was. But I want to say that the great honor of coming to the Italian Parliament, not only the great bastion of democracy in in Italy, but in Europe, and one of the great bastions in the world over in the free world. It's a great honor to discuss these issues that are so critical to the free world today and the international community at large. So a big thank you to all of you for joining us, and to Fiamma and to Mr. Cicitto and Mr. D'Ambroso for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to talk about morality. Morality is one of the most important subjects discussed in Israel. The morality of moral clarity. The idea of moral clarity in fighting terrorism. As General Kupperwasser pointed out, a lot of the discussion we have in Israel, in the public square, in the army, in the political echelons, and in the government have to do with tactical issues. But one of the underlying major issues, strategic issues, is moral clarity. And I mean the democratic dilemma. The democratic dilemma means, how do we, everybody in this room, as a member of the international community, as a believer in human rights, in civil rights, in the dignity of the individual, of every race, creed, background, every innocent person, how do we square our membership in the community of nations, of free nations, and the belief in democracy and universal human rights with the non-negotiable, unconditional rejection of terrorism of any kind, anywhere, wherever it happens? It seems that it's a contradiction in terms, but my message to you over the next few minutes is that it's not a contradiction, but a living tension that we have to live with as members of the international democratic community. Moral clarity, as I want to share with you in the next very few minutes, as I want to share it with you, has three dimensions. What is the moral makeup of our enemies, of the terrorists? In our case, the Arab and Islamic terrorists that have been engaging in all kinds of terrorism in Israel for the last 100 years, and more specifically the unique developments in the world of terrorism in the last 20 years, let's say. What goes on in their mind? What drives them? What is their moral DNA? The second aspect I'd like to explore in 2 or 3 minutes after that is how do we understand moral solidarity among us, among those in the international community of democratic states that care about human rights and reject, without any condition, terrorism under any circumstances. What is our moral solidarity? What we ask in Israel in that case is, are we standing alone as the nation state of the Jewish people, or do we enjoy moral solidarity not only with Italy and the rest of Europe, but the rest of the civilized world? And three, the final angle on moral clarity is the moral compass of Israel. What role does the moral embrace necessarily play in the small nation state of the Jewish people, in the public square, in the government levels, in our parliament, in our media, with regard to the fight against terrorism. So let me go to the first category. What is the moral makeup of the Arab and Islamic terrorists that are murdering Israelis of all backgrounds, by the way? Muslims, Israeli Christians, Israeli Jews. They as a lot of our military strategists have put it, we are in a moral asymmetry. A moral asymmetry opposite the terror threat from what is mostly radical Islamic jihadists. What does that mean? It means that in the moral mind of the terrorist, they make up their own rules from moment to moment. They have murdered entire families in their beds, including infants and small children, slaughtered them like sheep. They have, as Fiamma pointed out, is on the cover of our book, they have driven trucks into, just 2 months ago, a group of young people on a field trip in Jerusalem. They have shot in buses and schools, in mosques, in hospitals. They have blown themselves up in the public square. And Israelis wonder, what is it that drives a mind to make such an action? Many of the terrorists are not coming from the disputed West Bank, which we know in Israel is Judea and Samaria. They coming in the last recent terror attacks, jihadi attacks, they're coming from Jerusalem. In other words, there are terrorist residents of Jerusalem that have exactly the same social and economic rights as I do, and as General Cooper-Wasser does, and Fiamma, and every other person who is a resident or citizen of Israel. So the Israeli asks himself in the democratic dilemma, what is the moral makeup of such a personality? Well, let me read to you one sentence of what the PLO charter says in terms of understanding the enemy, how his mind works, what makes him tick or her. It's written in the charter, Zionism is a political movement organically associated with international imperialism. It is racist and fanatic in its nature, aggressive, expansionist, and colonial in its aims, and fascist in its methods. Therefore, the liberation of Palestine from an Arab viewpoint is a national duty and attempts to repel the Zionist and imperialist aggression against the Arab homeland and aims at the elimination of Zionism in Palestine. In other words, that is the type of maximalist moral ideology that is governing the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and its subset and its small organization, the PA. And in fact, it's not only the nationalist ideology that drives the moral clarity of the PLO, but listen to what Mahmoud Abbas said in the Islamist tradition just recently in this latest knifing intifada. He told the Palestinian television, September 2015, that we welcome every drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem. President Abbas says, this is pure blood, clean blood, blood on the way to Allah. With the help of Allah, every shaheed, every martyr will be in heaven, and every wounded will get his reward. That was his response to the terror campaign recently in Jerusalem and the areas around Jerusalem that claimed many tens of lives and many hundreds maimed. Now, the Hamas, when we think about the moral mind of the Hamas, one sentence will do. It says in the Hamas covenant, and you can find it if you go onto Google, you can find the Hamas covenant. I would urge you to take a look at what Israelis have understood to be their moral makeup. Well, it says the day of judgment will not come about until the Muslims kill the Jews. And when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees, the stones and trees will say, "O Muslims, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." This is just one sentence in the whole covenant about what we are dealing with the Hamas organization based primarily in Gaza. But you know, the Palestinian terrorist ideological appetite goes way beyond Israel. Did you know that the Hamas's Sheikh Yunus al-Astal, as Dr. Gold writes in his article, did you know that he declared on Hamas television, listen to this, it applies to you, Rome will be conquered like Constantinople. He added that Rome would become, quote, an advanced post for the Islamic conquests, which will spread through Europe in its entirety. And it goes on to say in the Hamas covenant that that the Islamic resistance movement views seriously the defeat of the Crusaders, that means the Christians, not the Jews, at the hands of Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi and the rescuing of Palestine from their hands. In other words, the moral mind of the Hamas, which is a major terror challenge today, puts the Christians and the Jews in the same boat. It has nothing to do with practicalities. It has nothing to do with the Palestinian state. It has nothing to do with any practical outcome. It is an ideological, moral position from their standpoint. Now, this creates a real challenge for us, for all of us, because, and the challenge is this: in recent months and the last few years, the major strategic program of the Hamas and the Hezbollah, meaning Iran's terror proxy in Lebanon, has been to gain international legitimacy. There is a competition between Hamas and the PLO for the future of the Palestinian control and leadership. And therefore, it requires tremendous moral solidarity, the second point of three that I'm making here today, for us to keep our moral glasses on and to see very clearly what's happening. Not to be deceived or deluded by Hamas leaders that wear suits from Boji or that wear ties from Hermes and convince you that they are normal, grassroots, peace, justice-loving individuals. Now, if you've noticed, there are some very disturbing examples in the international community of international moral legitimization and validation of the Hamas and the Hezbollah and the PLO. Just a few to refresh our memory. In 2015, the Advocate General of the European Union suggested that Hamas, who we just read a small part of their charter, be taken off the European terror list. Because in Europe there has been a tendency to make a differentiation between Hamas political echelon or political side and military side. And the same thing happened in Europe in 2013 with the Hezbollah. The Hezbollah was only placed on the European terror list in 2013, and then only the military side of Hezbollah. Hamas is still on the terror list, but the fact that there is a moral debate about taking off Hamas from the terror list and relating to the political side of Hezbollah as a legitimate organization should raise the moral debate to a very high level, and it should make us think very carefully about the dangers of international legitimization. You know that it is the Hamas that actually works through affiliates in London and in other European cities that file charges against Israeli political government and military leaders in London. In the Court of Human Rights, they mobilize young men and women with PhDs and advanced law degrees to prosecute Israel in the International Criminal Court, in the International Court of Justice of the United Nations, and to bring up Israel on charges of genocide. Israel on charges by the Hamas. How is that for an irony? Yeah. So we have a real problem with regard to Hamas. In fact, the problem is that there are those in the international community who have created a false moral equality between the democratic free state of Israel and the Hamas itself, as well as the PLO. And that has created moral confusion in the world. In fact, we know that even former President Barack Obama offered to mediate in the last war, terror war from Gaza between Hamas and the State of Israel, following his very strong recommendation that Qatar, a Muslim Brotherhood country, and Turkey, another Muslim Brotherhood country, become the mediators between Israel and the Hamas. Now, there is this international sympathy that we have seen for terror groups like the Hamas and like Hezbollah is very problematic. We know that the United Nations, even Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, came to Lebanon in 2000 and shook the hand of Hassan Nasrallah, who takes his direction from Khamenei in Tehran. And therefore, you have complete international legitimization by the most important international organization for Hezbollah. Now, what's the problem with international legitimization? It makes the terrorist energized to attack you. In other words, for people that sympathize with terrorism against Israel, you are energizing the Salafist terrorists from ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others who are attacking you in Brussels, in Paris, in Copenhagen, and in Berlin. And it works like this. The jihadists in Jerusalem and the jihadists in Berlin, Copenhagen, Brussels, and Paris don't differentiate between us and you. From their point of view, it's all the same. So when we try to show sympathy for certain kinds of terrorism, it only energizes and creates enthusiasm for the jihadists to murder you and the rest of those good people in the West with much greater sense of dedication. So there is only, in the terms of the second second sense of moral clarity, there is no way to make sympathy to terrorism of one kind and to fight terrorism of another kind. It must be unconditional, unqualified rejection of terrorism wherever it falls out, for whatever reason, at any time. And the Israeli public knows that. The Israeli public understands that point. The third part of what I wanted to chat about, just for 2 minutes. Am I okay on time? Just on the edge. Okay.
Time for them.
Okay. The last thing I want to say, and I think that General Kupwasser has covered it, and Fiamma has covered it, is the moral clarity of the Israeli. And we will stay out of the details. I urge you to read the book carefully, if you can, take an hour, because it's the most comprehensive analysis of all of the aspects of response to terrorism that I have seen in ever. But here's the point. Israel as a society is obsessed with the moral question in fighting terrorism. Obsessed with it. It comes up every day in every media conversation, in the public square. It comes up in our dinner table conversations on Shabbat. It is discussed in schools. It is discussed in youth groups. And I will just leave you with this. You know, we just went through 2 years of what they call the knifing terrorism, where hundreds of people were maimed by knifing and car ramming attacks. And even so, there was now a case of a young soldier, an 18-year-old soldier, whose unit was attacked while they were doing a peacekeeping mission for Israeli civilians, and he killed a terrorist in what they call unclear conditions. You know the story, I'm sure you saw it on television, that there was a question whether the terrorist was neutralized, he was down, or did the soldier think that he was going to pull a strap and explode himself. Now, what I think is a very important critical element of this entire moral conversation is that this has been the front and center of the whole moral conversation in Israel for months and months.
You didn't see that he has been condemned by the...
Yes, and he was found guilty by the court and he's going to jail. Now this is in the context of a country that is facing terrorism and death and destruction every single day, and yet, as we said in the beginning of the talk, it is the tension of the morality of being in the democratic dilemma, of maintaining the health, of being able to even send one of your own soldiers to jail because he did not act according to what General Kupwasser is talking, which is the spirit of the IDF, the ethical code of the IDF, the purity of arms in the IDF, and there still is a debate about whether about how that falls out. Was he was he was found guilty, but there is a major debate in Israeli society, and there has been for months and months and months. It's the debate, it's the moral debate that, that characterizes the health and vitality of all of our democracies. So I say to all of us, let us all together stand together, men and women of Europe, of the free world, and Israel together, to maintain our commitment to human rights and values, but with an uncompromising rejection of terrorism. Thank you very much. Grazie, grazie.
Adesso possiamo...
And we can now begin our discussion on some of the issues that you have raised. I'll give the floor over to Mr. Manzulli. And when it comes to NATO issues, together with Mr. D'Ambroso, they are in fact our leading experts on terrorism, and they're working in fact on some legislation on radicalization. Well, first of all, I wish to thank Fiamma and our guests. I think that this is a wonderful initiative. It is hugely important, and I think that the concluding remarks of this final presentation has hit the issue right on the nail. In fact, the speaker spoke at length about the morality of counterterrorism, and I think that this is the core issue that Europe needs to consider. For years, relatively speaking, we've had calm, as it were, in the European political space, and because of those years of calm, of tranquility, people are not so concerned about security. However, we are in a paradox. In fact, the culture of security is going back. It's a sort of setback, and unfortunately what might happen is that the fear might become widespread, and when that happens, it is interpreted and dealt with in the worst possible way. At NATO, I focus on jihadist terrorism. This is the subject that I'm doing my research on, and NATO is in Brussels. It's headquartered in Brussels, for example. I think this is a very good example. And when in your city, for many years, people ignored what was happening because it wasn't happening there. But in that city, my secretary at NATO allowed her children, her 12-year-old children, and I don't do that in my own country, she let them go to the theater on their own, to the movies on their own. And in a few months' time, because of those terrorist attacks, people changed their lives considerably. After years during which nothing of that was seen anywhere, and yet in Israel, they're used to that. And of course, when it appears abruptly, it is very, very difficult, even for policymakers, to know how to deal with it. I've had a chance to look through the book. And I've taken part in many meetings on counterterrorism. Italy and Israel have organized these meetings. They've been very intense, very direct, I would say. And let me focus on a point that I think we should all ponder together in our debate today. Should we continue to only speak about terrorism? And this is the position which is coming out more and more at NATO, forcefully. There's been a changeover from Al-Qaeda to Daesh, and I think that this has drastically changed the nature of this subject matter, because Daesh is not only terrorism. And in fact, if you will, there was a break between Al-Qaeda and Daesh, and this is the exact issue that we need to focus on. And of course, there are others that are covered, other organizations covered in the book. Al-Qaeda was a terrorist organization. It was an elite organization. It was clandestine. And it was a very acute threat that was perceived, but it was concealed. It was hidden, as it were. Of course, they were perpetrating the attacks here and there. Bin Laden made a speech in 1998, and then there was a program in 2004 on a new world order. That was bin Laden's program in 2004 on a new world order. And you can see from that, from his words and from this plan, that Al-Qaeda was focusing on this agenda. They were building up a threat that was projected out into time. Over a long term. In fact, Al-Qaeda was forecasting the establishment of an Islamic State, but further out in time and in a very, very gradual manner. The real diversity and the reason for the break, for the rift, and I see many people here today who are experts, I would say, who are knowledgeable, and this break wasn't only due to some internal factor within Al-Qaeda, because Daesh is an impure union between Al-Qaeda and a Ba'ath component, which had a very serious role. The Ba'ath component. I usually have some notes with me, but I didn't bring any notes today. But if you take the top 10 military leaders of Daesh, you'll realize that eight of those military leaders were in the Camp Bucca prison, and 6 of the 8 were members of the Ba'ath Party. So it doesn't take a genius, as it were, to understand. You see, this is a new organization. It has broken away from Al-Qaeda for 2 fundamental reasons. And the second, I think, is even more dangerous than the first. We have a definition. We've come up with a definition which stems from mythology. I think you'll remember the monster Hydra with many heads. And there was one main feature. The heads of the monster of Hydra, when they were attacked, one at a time, would just grow back. And in order to defeat the monster, Hercules somehow had to cut all 3 heads off at the same time. So Daesh, and there were more than 3 heads, but in any case, we can say there were 3, because Daesh is a 3-headed monster, in fact. And of the 3 heads, 2 are new. The first is conventional warfare. Daesh is not only a form of terrorism, it is a mix between, it's a hybrid war which joins terrorism with conventional warfare to build up a state. Now, you can perhaps push this a bit further and say that that desire was enforced by the Ba'ath component. The head of the Daesh operations is Ajik Bakr, who was the number 2 of the Muharabat operations under Saddam Hussein. And he was perfectly familiar with the theater in which the state was being built in. But the main point of this conventional warfare is the ultimate aim of the war. And this brings me to the second head, which I think is the real issue at hand. The second head is supported by the first, because war is being waged in order to create a state that wants to become the homeland of all radicals of the planet, the homeland of jihadists all over the world, with a flag. And it is a way to create the imaginary, something that Al-Qaeda did before that, but in a very elite manner. Today, instead, we're dealing with an issue whereby Western technologies are being used. This is an unprecedented phenomenon, and the numbers show that. The foreign fighters that used to exist during the Afghan war, well, in 10 years' time, during that conflict, there were no more than 10,000 foreign fighters, and they were people who were about 30 years old, and they were strongly Islamized. Today, intelligence agencies in the West have given a different estimate, but everyone agrees that there are at least 40,000 foreign fighters in just a 3-year period of time. And what surprises us most is that the average age of this population of fighters has gone from 30 all the way down to 16 to 25 years. And the Islamization rate, as it were, has weakened, and in some cases it's entirely absent. Instead, there is a media war, which I think is the second head. And this is the most important and troubling one, because this is linked to our world, even in the Gaza Strip, even in Israel. This is what links our worlds. And we've discussed this in our counter-terrorist committees. So this phenomenon used to have a more traditional component, whereas now there is an interest in the media form, in the globalization of jihad, which produces effects inside and outside, and it creates support groups inside and outside. So I hope that point is clear, this point that I'm trying to make. If we need to defeat this enemy, we have to destroy the second head, and that's why Stefano and I are here. In our country, we've presented a bill, a law, which comes before. It is a form of prevention before having to combat radicalization. And in fact, even at NATO, we say we cannot only use military means to defeat this enemy. It's an enemy that also has to be tackled in a preventive manner. In other words, we have to deal with issues that we never thought we were going to have to deal with. So I have something here. I don't have my notes, but I have this. It's a report. It's a new report that we're going to vote on during the assembly of the Mediterranean Special Group at NATO in Sarajevo next week. And this is still confidential. It's still embargoed. But in any case, there's a picture here. It's not very clear, but it's a picture of one of the most famous video games on the market right now. It's very popular among teenagers all over the world. It's called Call of Duty. The Islamic State has created a game which originates from this, but it's the other way around. A 14-year-old boy, 14-year-old boy, who's playing Call of Duty can choose which nation of all the Western armies to interpret. Instead, here it's the opposite. You fight against the Westerners here. And the new game, the new game is called Call in Jihad. And basically, it's just the opposite version of our view of the world. Now, it wouldn't be a problem except for the fact that there are so many youngsters between the ages of 10 and 15 that are playing the game. And not only jihadists, they are youngsters who like to think they're on the other side. So, unless we realize that there is a woodworm, as it were, that is penetrating this scenario, we have to realize what's happening. I mean, I like to take part in meetings with my colleagues from Israel who work on counterterrorism, but that effort was addressing a number of people who can't even be compared to the numbers of supporters that are coming out gradually. So what we're hoping for today is something, that should have already been achieved in the past. We have to work quickly in order to defeat and tackle and take down terrorism. a huge leap forward needs to be made. Now, the third head, I've left for last. I won't say much about it because the first two are very clear. But the third is terrorism. Terrorism is that additional form that is being used in order to perpetrate this attack. It's an actual attack, and we have to analyze it for what it is. Let me just say one more thing about terrorism, and then I'll wrap up with some practical proposals. I'll be very brief. So beware, be careful. In the media, and I'm often on television and all sorts of programs. I have lots of friends, and what they're saying is that Mosul has almost been entirely taken. There will be an attack in Raqqa, they're saying, and then with the elimination of the first head, we're gradually resolving the problem. But this is a huge mistake that's being made, because paradoxically, the fruits resulting from the creation of a flag and a state, that's an ideal homeland, as it were, for many people. I don't know what to call them, people who are evil-minded. This will end up being an accelerator of the reaction. And this reaction, in all likelihood, will take place within our borders, because it feeds on empty spaces, on vacuums. If you analyze the two settings where terrorism has actually taken root, well, the vacuums, the areas that are of two kinds, geopolitical vacuums, first Al-Qaeda, then Daesh. Where did they take root? In all those collapsed, failed states where there's an issue with the borders, Sudan, Yemen, Libya, and part of Sahel, and even in certain areas of a state that are less controlled. The leading organization, first it was Al-Qaeda, now it's supporting Daesh, is in Sinai. And people in Israeli counterterrorism know that. Sinai is a stronghold. Sinai is a stronghold for jihadism between Egypt and Israel. And an interesting point that I've learned in Israel is this. It's the relationship between those organizations and the organizations that are in the Gaza Strip. But we don't only have these geopolitical vacuums. We've got other vacuums, moral vacuums, as it were. Because if Molenbeek happened, if there are outskirts of cities, and even here in Italy, we've got people who support jihad, and they come from certain backgrounds, and that shows that in addition to these geopolitical vacuums, they're also trying to occupy, as it were, other spaces that are not physical but that are moral. And they can do that only by bringing these two points together. So let me wrap up with two proposals. What do we need to do urgently today? We have a global enemy with an ideology and a widespread and standardized practice. And it changes. Over the past few weeks, we've been following Rumia, which means Rome. And they used to have Dabik, for example. And in Dabik, they taught you how to make a bomb with a pressure cooker. And they were forecasting the attacks perpetrated with trucks and vehicles, and we've seen those now. So the techniques used by terrorism have this global message, and we need to work on this, I think, and focus on it more, but we don't have the same laws. Italy, I think, is one of the countries that has been doing a wonderful job, thanks to Stefano as well. He works on the justice side, and we've introduced in our code new offenses, criminal offenses that didn't used to exist in our counterterrorism decree. And the decree, I think, has been very serious. And now we are working on legislation through which we can prevent radicalization. That's very serious. And next week, this is where the spotlight needs to be turned on. Tomorrow morning, right in this room, we organized a meeting on terrorism and terrorism in the Balkans. In the Balkans, there are no states with the offense in their code of self-training, self-recruitment. That criminal offense doesn't exist in the Balkans. There's no prevention, no law for the prevention of radicalization. So there are no legislative standards in that area, not like we have in Europe. Only Italy, France, Germany, and some northern European countries like Holland and Denmark have a system that will become complete with enforcement and prevention, as Israel has. So if we want to win this battle, the challenge that we have to face together is to convince everyone to adopt counterterrorism laws and have a preventative system. They have to go all the way to schools and prisons, because that is where radicalization occurs very forcefully. So we have to work hard to set up a standard, a serious one, and it has to impact many practical matters. Let me tell you what one of the most practical issues is in counterterrorism. The purchase of telephone cards. In some countries, you can buy a telephone SIM card only if you show your identity document and your taxpayer identification number, and therefore immediately you can be recognized. Whereas in other countries, you can buy a telephone SIM card without showing any document whatsoever. And when Amri was killed, in his pocket he had all sorts of SIM cards that he bought in many different countries, and he was very careful. He was very careful in purchasing those. So we cannot take down terrorism unless we act seriously. We've got a lot to learn from Israel, and what we do has to have an impact. Let me go back to the moral question. We mustn't forget that the moral dimension is the fundamental one, because if you can use military forces to defeat head number 1 and head number 3, there is a campaign which creates supporters, and you can combat that only culturally. And people need to feel the importance of counterterrorism. There's a moral underlying that.
Grazie. La parola all'onorevole D'Ambroso.
Thank you, and now Mr. D'Ambroso. Thank you. Well, I'm the last speaker, so I will definitely be very brief, because I know that people get a bit tired. We've had many interesting presentations. Clearly, Israel plays an important role within this dimension, and for many years I've worked together with the Israeli security organizations, and I had the opportunity to work with many colleagues, and I realized in my work how many differences there are in our cultural approach to counterterrorism. In Europe, and in particular in Italy, we practice counterterrorism in a certain way, and we know that in Israel it's different, because they deal with this on a daily basis. And we're here to comment the book, but not only the book, of course. The book, however, covers a number of different matters, and it is interesting to take a comparative approach and to compare what happens in Italy. And I'm addressing the Italians who are here, of course, and Italian residents of Israeli origin. It might be interesting, I was saying, to try to understand the state of the art in counterterrorism in our country and the approach that is being taken in Italy. So we've heard from a number of speakers. Fiamma referred to resilience, and we are privileged because in Italy we have not had to experience this kind of phenomenon, these attacks here in our country. perpetrated by terrorism. If we had those attacks, we would have some sort of emergency legislation, but we didn't have that, and that's why we're not in this emergency mode, and we're working on some legislation. Therefore, as we heard from my friend Andrea Manciulli, legislation on prevention, and on how to balance enforcement and prevention. Let me say something about that later. So fortunately, we haven't had the need to create those innate antibodies as you have in other countries where these terrorist attacks are frequent. So this is the resilience that Fiamma was talking about. And it is dealt with in a very interesting manner in the book. And I was also very interested in hearing from General Cooperwasser and my friend Dijker. They spoke about two matters in particular that are interesting for our debate this afternoon. Again, a comparison between Italy and what happens on a daily basis in Italy. And I'm referring to counterterrorism in Italy, which is obviously also handled by our intelligence agency, but not only by intelligence, because here in our country, I mean, I'm speaking in my capacity as a magistrate, because I was trained as a magistrate before becoming a politician. And when you're fighting any form of crime, this kind of background helps in our understanding because we realize that we have to strike a balance. We have to find a balance between our constitution and our code, and in particular with the need to guarantee security for all our citizens. So we need to strike a balance which includes not only respect for the code, which is what intelligence typically does, but on the other side, we have our judiciary. And in this last step of counterterrorism, we use the work of our intelligence agencies. Again, our intelligence people have a hard job in collecting all the information, but that information then has to be processed. The intelligence data and information has to be processed by our judicial police, by our law enforcement agencies that are specialized, the investigators, the DIGOS for the police and ROS for the Carabinieri, but also the finance police, when we're talking about terrorist financing. So they are specialized groups of law enforcement operatives, and they're the ones who process the intelligence that is provided. Of course, we have to respect democratic principles, and in order to do that, we need to end the process with a judgment, which what makes all this work constitutional. We need to respect a fundamental rule in this entire process, and that is that there was a prosecution even for the worst terrorist, the most dangerous terrorist, because there's a right to defense. Everyone needs to be able to defend himself or herself, even when it comes to counterterrorism. The American security apparatus has been criticized because they thought they could guarantee security for their citizens by segregating. In Guantanamo, in the Guantanamo prison, more than 1,000 terrorist suspects or full-blown terrorists, and they were widely criticized for doing that. Not so much because of the quasi-torture that was used, but for the fact that for more than 10 years, there were detainees who were deprived of their liberty and who were never able to go before a judge, even a military judge, in order to exercise one of our fundamental rights. I mean, we have that. in Europe, even before Italy, are rights that everyone has. We've seen it through the Hollywood movies, and we all appreciate the American lifestyle. And we've learned about the American lifestyle by watching those television programs and the movies produced in Hollywood. So the fact that there was no right to a defense granted to the Guantanamo detainees, and remember that Guantanamo, for security reasons in the United States after 9/11, and of course the situation in Israel is even worse. They need to work more on their security than in the U.S., but in the U.S. they haven't yet shut down Guantanamo, even though Obama was elected twice because he promised to shut down Guantanamo. And democratic presidents and presidents who wanted this kind of change after Bush were not able to shut down Guantanamo, the Guantanamo prison, because security is still a priority, and you cannot relinquish that, not even when the criticism has been so harsh. And what about France, and therefore Europe in general? Even the French are criticizing their country. The foreign homegrown terrorists, they are European citizens who were raised in France and who then perpetrated these attacks in their own cities. And they thought they could create a small Guantanamo there, because the French security apparatus could not guarantee that more than 600 dangerous suspects could be supervised 24 hours a day. They didn't have the resources to do that. So in order to supervise them all together, all those suspects, they wanted to put them in a sort of castle near Paris where they could do that. But even though it was an emergency situation because of the two terrible attacks that they had between early 2015 and the end of 2015, Charlie Hebdo and Bataclan, the Constitutional Court reiterated the importance of the fact that even with counterterrorism, you have to abide by the fundamental principles of democracy, and that is the right to defense, to a trial. Let me go back to what Daniel Dijker said when he mentioned some difficulties and the dynamics in Israel in the relationship between the actions of the judiciary and counterterrorism. Well, just think that in Europe, where the situation is complex, I mean, our territory can be attacked. It has been attacked by fundamentalists. Well, here in Europe, well, the European Court for Human Rights in Strasbourg, the ECHR, if you're accustomed to this acronym, condemned our country for not having guaranteed to some detainees already convicted in Italy on grounds of terrorism, because they were detained in prisons or cells that were too small compared to the standard average of prison cells in Europe. And we're not, I mean, these are our prisons where everyone is detained, even our citizens. And this was just before the phenomenon of the foreign fighters, in other words, of citizens who were perpetrating these attacks against their own fellow nationals. And we've had those decisions from the European Court of Human Rights that were indeed newsworthy. And law enforcement people were perplexed because of these decisions, of these judgments coming from Strasbourg against a country like Italy. And it made it impossible. It made it impossible to remove from our country terrorists who had already been convicted and who had served their sentence. We couldn't send them back to their country of origin because up until 2010 and 11, before the Arab Springs and before the fall of the dictatorships, the removal from Italian soil would not have guaranteed to them a democratic detention. So you see, in our country and all over Europe, considering the fact that we had the Schengen Agreement and therefore there were no border controls and you could freely move from one country to the next. So we had to keep in our country and keep under supervision, under surveillance, people who had already been convicted for acts of terrorism, who had served their sentence. So they were terrorists. I mean, a legal definition was possible at that point, but we couldn't send them back. We couldn't remove them and send them back home because we had to abide by this principle whereby we needed to make sure that they would have a democratic detention back home. So you see, it was very difficult to strike this balance between the rights of even the most dangerous terrorists on the one hand, and on the other, the need to guarantee security. So that's what we used to have to do. And then suddenly, we had people who could move about freely throughout our capitals and kill their own fellow citizens. So that's the difference. It used to be one way, and now it's this that we have to deal with. And it is very difficult for us. And here in Italy, fortunately, we haven't yet had these terrorist attacks. Well, what have we been doing? We realize that there is a risk of terrorism which is different. It's a different form of terrorism, not Al-Qaeda-like. It is very difficult to control this new form of terrorism because there are individuals, as we've already heard from the others, there's an individual who sits in front of his computer at home and he self-recruits himself, and there is some sort of preaching that he finds on a website, and he decides to join, to become a member of ISIS, of the Caliphate, for example, and therefore this is a form of self-recruitment. And then there is self-training as well, because on internet, at home, he doesn't have to leave his home. He can learn how to create a bomb, which will then be used. And this is something that has already happened in Italy. So we decided to introduce some laws, some norm provisions that did not exist in previous times in order to criminalize this kind of conduct. In other words, we wanted to make sure that those people could go to jail, people who maybe never even left their homes, but I mean, this is a violation of one of the main principles of our Constitution. In other words, the material conduct which is somehow linked to an offense. So we've already had some convictions, and today you can convict to 3 to 8 years of people who do this, who do self-recruitment and who do self-training and who even organize their travels. They buy a ticket on internet to go to Istanbul. Up till 2 years ago, it was a very attractive capital, one of the most capitals in Europe before Erdogan started doing what we're seeing now. It was unthinkable 2 years ago. So up until 2 years ago, you could buy a ticket to go to Istanbul. So the ticket was purchased by someone who was already known to be perhaps close to one of these organizations. And that was another offense. Again, he could be convicted to prison from 3 to 7 or 8 years. So we realized that we needed to react to this. We needed to be to have harsher, more rigorous approach. I talked earlier about removing to their home countries people who had been convicted and served their sentence. Well, we've introduced new punishments that didn't exist in the past because of this need. And we did that after Charlie Hebdo in 2015. We did it under this government. we've been asked, what have you been doing over the past 5 years? Many people think we haven't done anything, but when it comes to security, this is something we have achieved. We have more instruments in the hands of the law enforcement operatives, and it is possible for intelligence operatives to be more effective. We have the anti-terrorism prosecutor's office at national level, so this is what we've been doing. Because of what happened in Paris and all over Europe, but we know that it isn't sufficient to punish, it isn't sufficient to have enforcement, but parallel to that, we've got to keep working. Parallel to this, we have to have a sort of interreligious and intercultural dialogue. That doesn't mean that we want to be good necessarily, because that's not what we want. But we need to stop thinking about elections that might be held in a year's time. We need to stop trying to please our voters who are worried about their security. And we have to start thinking of our children, our grandchildren, because in 10, 15 years' time, here in our country, they're going to have to be living alongside a Muslim community, more and more members of that community, because of this epoch-making phenomenon that is very difficult for us to manage, migration. Migration is not necessarily bringing terrorists, but a Muslim community that will take root here in our territory, and the numbers are going to double, they're going to triple in the next 10 to 15 years. Today we're talking about 2 million Muslims. Here in Italy, we don't have issues in terms of our daily coexistence, but in 10 to 15 years' time, the second generation members of these communities are going to be attending Italian schools. Obviously, they're going to be sitting side by side our children, our grandchildren, and there are going to be more and more of them in 15 years. So our professors, we heard earlier about investing on education. Well, our professors, our teachers are going to have to do something that they haven't yet done. They're going to have to be good at intercultural dialogue. We haven't developed that yet. They have to learn how to engage in this dialogue. And then what about the prisons? This is another area that we're working on. We have to avoid well, for example, I'm talking about undocumented migrants coming from North Africa who commit an offense and who have to go to prison. But when they go to prison, they are common criminals and thieves, but they become radicalized there. Why? Because there were so-called imam preachers in those prisons as well, and they were not monitored. And they didn't respect our fundamental rights. So that's why radicalization occurs in prisons. That's what we're trying to monitor that. Our minister, Minniti, is now working on this, and we can't go back any longer. So we need to get Muslims involved. It is difficult today because there are different ethnic groups. They don't only have one leader, as it were. So there's a working group. And what we want to do is to select the imams who can go into those prisons. They have to be respectful of our fundamental rights. And before I wrap up, I will make this point. In the book, you talk about cyber terrorism. You talk about internet, communication via internet, which is unmonitored. Well, in the D'Ambrosio Manciulli law, we are asking the government to find the funds to fund some projects that will be run by experts For example, we know that there are young people who use their smartphones and who are reached and who receive jihadist messages through internet on their smartphones, and there's no counter information to help them realize what would happen to them if they were to do even 1/10 of the things that are being suggested to them. you talked about Call of Duty earlier, the video game that was changed, and that was very interesting, in fact. So we're doing this here in our country, and we have an approach which is aware of the emergencies that are being experienced in other European countries because of the attacks that have taken place there. So we think that we are ready to cooperate. We can cooperate in a synergistic and useful manner with the other security organizations all over Europe. I have 1,000 more things to say, but I don't have time, so thank you. Let me stop now.
No, volevo dire una cosa di un secondo.
Very briefly, I don't want to take up more time, and our chairman has to wrap up our meeting. There is an idea in something that has occurred to me, an ideal and practical conclusion at the same time. And this idea has been confirmed by the remarks by Stefano and Andrea. Stefano has emphasized the proximity between the Western world and the background of part of the terrorist phenomenon. This has reached a paradoxical dimension in Israel because that type of terrorism is engendered in the very womb of Israeli society. You just go to a hospital, to a shopping mall, in a square, public park. The Israelis live in a total and ongoing proximity with that type of world. So we cannot really talk about dialogue because there can be no dialogue revolving around religions or ideologies. The point is that you've got to coexist side by side without racism, with a spirit of tolerance, without the ambition to question burkinis or other non-aggressive clothing, but if the need arises, you have to react. What you were saying about this dialogue developing is quite interesting, but rather than speaking of dialogue, because dialogue cannot solve all these problems, what we do need is coexistence breeding respect. Familiarity breeding respect, and of course the action of the judiciary is all important. In Israel, the court has found guilty the Israeli soldier. There are, of course, Islamic terrorists who were convicted, but the few Israeli terrorists are convicted as well. And very quickly, Andrea Manciulli was referring to the global dimension of terror and the need for a global response. All of these inputs converge towards my or our own primary source of inspiration when we thought about this book. Our inspiration was very straightforward. After the Berlin attacks, everybody was writing in the newspaper, let's follow the example of Israel, let's imitate Israel. And we thought we need to provide a cultural response. We cannot just hover in this half abstract, half ignorant discourse. Because there was an underlying nuance. Let's follow Israel's example, as Dorigold was saying. There is something missing, the explicit recognition that All terrorism needs to be rejected, unconditionally rejected. I think that all of us should leave this room, Fabrizio, Andrea, Stefano, and all of us, with the plan to raise these matters in all possible fora within the national parliament, the European Parliament, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. We must make this clear statement, an ambiguous statement. Terrorism must be rejected unconditionally. There are not different types of terrorism. I think that the attitude towards Israel, when you have the list of international terrorists, those who attack Israeli targets are not included in those lists. This is outrageous. People have been slaughtered in their bedrooms. I mean, and that those people are removed from the international blacklist. This is outrageous. I think the meaning, the ultimate meaning of this conversation should be political. This is why I am appealing to you, to the members of parliament, to the diplomats. I'm very grateful for your presence. We must be clear. We must state very clearly that there are not different types of terrorism. And the definition, if international organizations find it difficult to reach a uniform definition of terrorism, that's their problem. The definition of terrorism lies in reality.
I won't draw any conclusions. I would simply like to make some assessments. Based on our strong solidarity with Israel, considering all the incidents that have taken place there. In the Middle East, Israel is the only democracy where there's a majority, a minority, and where there is an inter-party clash, very similar to what happens here in Italy with political parties. Maybe you're more efficient than we are when it comes to your governments, fortunately for you. But let me start there and say that there are some commonalities, some differences, and I'm going to say something as an Italian. I can't say that we are virgins. We're not virgins when it comes to terrorism. We've experienced it in the 70s and the 80s. In fact, we had a form of Italian terrorism on the extreme right and on the extreme left. And I say this because unfortunately and tragically, there are different versions of terrorism. One version stemmed from ideologies gone wild from the West, as it were. And this is something that happened here and in Germany in particular. In other Western countries, we didn't see that same phenomenon. And I say this to avoid an exaggerated form of ideologization. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, I think that we have to avoid two opposing schemes or patterns when it comes to Islamic terrorism. What do I mean by that? Well, one pattern has to do, for example, with Obama, who never used an adjective for this noun. I think that was a very serious cultural mistake. But don't nod, because I'm about to say something now which you might not agree with. And that is that you shouldn't dare to say that all of the Muslim world and Islam are part of this terrorist dynamic. That, I think, would support somehow the proselytism, Islamic proselytism. An important battle, not a military one, but a cultural battle, must be waged And that's why dialogue is important, as Fiamma said. A cultural battle, because we know that in the Muslim world there are different kinds of positions, and there are non-terrorist positions which have to be strengthened and highlighted, because that's important to avoid Islamic extremism all over. We need to identify Islamic terrorism with those words, but to isolate it. To isolate it and not to make it widespread, and to put everyone in the same category, as it were. So, of course, there have been mistakes made, as also in our relations with Israel. But some things that were said in El-Azhar, and even by the Egyptian authorities, have resulted in a cultural debate in the Muslim world, whereby they're challenging culturally jihadism and Al-Qaeda and their decisions. And this is something that would be, I think, a huge mistake if we were to use different versions where we don't use Islamic when we talk about terrorism, or where we generalize and just condemn everyone. And now another point. Let me just express something in addition to what Mr. D'Ambrosio said. Here in Italy, we are not in the same position as France, for example. We don't have historic banlieues that are so rooted and that were very difficult to govern and manage. But in Italy, what has helped us to avoid attacks has been prevention. Now, when I say prevention, it's not a question of the judiciary. Fortunately, we did have removals, expulsions. In many cases, the judiciary handed down judgments that were hair-raising. Because the situation was indeed questionable, but fortunately the Ministry of the Interior did something which they didn't do in Germany, and in fact we saw what happened then in Germany, whereas here we had a systematic removal in more recent times of anyone who engaged in any conduct that could somehow be linked to terrorism, even if only how they use their computers. So that was a form of prevention. And we did that, and thanks to that, we have helped to avoid, up to now, any major damage coming from similar attacks. Now, I agree with the analysis that we've heard from Andrea just a moment ago. But we should also acknowledge the mistakes. That have resulted in ISIS, which ISIS or Daesh, it doesn't matter what you call them, but this is different in any case from Islamic terrorism that exists in Israel. I think this is a different phenomenon, and in fact it is something that ended up being an army, a state even. But why has this happened? And why has Libya become so destabilized? Because of mistakes of an opposite sign that were made by two American presidents. And I'm referring to the mistake made by Bush Jr., not Bush Sr., because Bush Sr. took down Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait, but then he stopped his generals, because he realized that by toppling Saddam Hussein, he was going to trigger a mechanism that could no longer be controlled. So instead, Bush Jr. did something else. He hit hard, and he eliminated Saddam Hussein's army and the Ba'ath Party, and that is what partially resulted in ISIS and Daesh, because ISIS and Daesh are made up of some people who are conveying cultural messages, but then their network and their military methodology is based on former generals of Saddam Hussein's army and former members of the Ba'ath Party who reacted to their dismantling. And the consequence was an overturning of the American logic, which was right. In other words, to try to get Iran and Iraq to oppose one another. But their masterpiece in the end was that in Iraq, the Shia came to power and they linked up with the Iranians, and the consequences have been very negative. And Obama authorized the intervention in Libya, which was reckless. You can't do that unless you either have a tyrant who is better than the one you're getting rid of, or a democratic setup that is better in qualitative terms. So they didn't have either of the two. And now we see what's happened. So as I said, Obama, all he had to do was to withdraw. And this zigzagging, I think, has resulted in further damage in Afghanistan and in Iraq as well. And belatedly, they were corrected to some degree, but the consequences have been negative. I won't go into that now because obviously we don't have time. I won't go into what's happened in Syria, of course. So we have all these mistakes that have been made in the past, all these contradictions, and some of them have had spillovers, therefore, in what's happening in Israel, but only to an extent, because fortunately, the dimension of what is happening in Israel has stayed within its dimension, the same dimension that we've had over the years. But now I have to add an additional factor. Unfortunately, I say, Hamas has expanded, and I'm worried about that. I'm worried about the political difficulties being experienced by the only interlocutor, the PLO. If we want to say something not in diplomatic terms, PLO was victim of its corruption, because of corruption, they lost credibility among the Palestinians, and the regime in Gaza, after the coup d'etat, we forget that there was a coup d'etat against the PLO, and we see that there are spillovers, dramatic spillovers for the population, the people who are forced to live in this situation. I'm going to stop here. I know that we all have so much more to say. I realize that what I've just said can be viewed differently, and we could have a debate, but we shouldn't have these predetermined patterns or ideas, because they've all been belied by a reality that we all have right now before our eyes, and that we realize is so complex. So again, I confirm our solidarity, our close relations, on my behalf and on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee overall and the Italian government. We've always had this solidarity. We will always continue to support Israel. And unfortunately, with regard to the UNESCO affair, there was a bit of a slip on the Italian side.
parte.
El vero problema es la quantità de